The letter arrived on a Tuesday, which was the same day they told Eliza Voss she had 36 hours to get out. Sister Margaret didn't say it with cruelty. That was almost worse. She said it the way you'd tell someone the kitchen closes at 6, flat and final. Her hands folded over the ledger like the numbers inside it explained everything. "The board has reviewed your case," she said, not looking up. "You've aged out of our care. We found a placement." Eliza was 24 years old and had lived inside the walls of Harlow House for as long as she could remember. She had scrubbed its floors, mended its curtains, taught younger children to read using a Bible with the back pages torn out. She had never once been told she was a burden. She had simply assumed she was useful enough to stay. She was wrong. "What kind of placement?" she asked. Sister Margaret slid a single folded paper across the desk. "Ranch work, out west. A man named Mercer needs a capable hand and has agreed to take someone from our house." She paused. "The arrangement benefits everyone." Eliza looked at the paper. There was a name. Wyatt Mercer. A location. Raven Hollow, 2 days by rail. A single line of description that made her chest go cold. Experienced in livestock care and ranch operations. She looked up. "I've never worked a ranch?" "You've worked here," Sister Margaret said, and closed the ledger. The train ride west took 2 days and a night, and Eliza spent most of it watching the landscape change outside the window. The soft greens of the east giving way to something harder, browner, stripped of any pretension. She had one bag. In it, 2 dresses, a pair of worn boots, a small tin of salve her friend Clara had pressed into her hands at the station, and the letter Sister Margaret had given her, which she'd read so many times the crease had split. She wasn't angry yet. She kept waiting to be, kept prodding at the thing the way you'd test a sore tooth with your tongue. But what came instead was a low, gray exhaustion. She had known, in some formless way, that Harlow House would not keep her forever. She had simply believed she'd have more say in when and where forever ended. There was a man across the aisle who fell asleep with his hat over his face, and she envied him his ability to rest. She sat up most of the night watching the dark come in. A woman in the seat ahead of her turned around at some point, took in Eliza's expression, and said, "First time going west?" "Yes," Eliza said. "Don't let it fool you," the woman said. "The land looks empty, but it isn't. It just doesn't show you what it's got right away." She turned back around and didn't say anything else, but Eliza held on to that. She had a habit of holding on to small things when there was nothing larger to grab. The town of Raven Hollow was exactly what its name suggested. A narrow collection of buildings hunkered into a valley like something crouching out of the wind. Eliza stepped off the stage with her bag and stood in the dust while other passengers dispersed around her. A woman with a basket hurried past. 2 men in heavy coats talked outside the post office. Nobody looked at her. She found the livery stable. She asked for directions to the Mercer Ranch. The stableman, a thick-necked man with a gray beard and eyes that moved too slowly, looked her over from boot to collar. "Mercer Ranch," he repeated. "Yes, Raven Hollow Ranch. I have a letter." He looked at the letter without taking it. "You the new hire?" "I believe so." He said nothing for a moment. Then he made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. "Well," he said, "Mercer's gonna love this." He pointed north. 3 miles. Follow the road past the creek crossing. You'll see the gate." She asked if there was a way to get a ride. He pointed at her feet. Well, the road was 3 miles of flat cold, and Eliza walked every inch of it, with her bag straps cutting into her palm, and the wind pushing against her like it had somewhere better to be. She wasn't built small. She was broad through the shoulder, with hands that had scrubbed and hauled and kneaded bread dough since she was 9 years old. But the land out here had a scale that made a person feel reduced. The sky was enormous. The silence had weight. She saw the gate before she saw the ranch, 2 iron-banded posts with the name burned into a plank overhead. Raven Hollow. Below the name, someone had hung a crow's skull on a piece of wire, which she chose not to read too deeply into. The ranch itself spread out behind the gate in a series of structures that told you a great deal about the man who ran it before you ever met him. The main house was solid, nothing decorative, 2 stories of timber and stone that had been built to last rather than to impress. The barn was larger than the house, which said something about priorities. The fencing was in good repair. The yard between was hard-packed and bare. There was a horse in the far paddock. She stopped when she saw it. She didn't know much about horses. That was part of the problem, and she was aware of it. But she knew enough to know that what she was looking at was something outside the ordinary. The horse was black, not the soft black of shadow or night, but something more absolute, as if color itself had declined to touch him. He stood at the far fence with his sides heaving, his head raised, and even at that distance she could read the posture as something closer to fury than agitation. There were marks on his flank. The paddock fence had boards missing along one side, recently replaced with different colored wood. Whatever had happened there, it hadn't been long ago. She made herself look away and walked to the front door. She knocked. Nobody came. She knocked again, louder, and after a moment she heard boots on a wooden floor. Not hurrying, the footsteps of someone who moved through the world at their own pace, regardless of who was waiting. The door opened, and she got her first look at Wyatt Mercer. He was somewhere in his middle 30s, tall in the way that looks like it cost something. A hardness across the jaw, a heaviness around the eyes, the particular stillness of a man who had learned that moving too fast got people killed or horses broken or crops failed, and had organized his whole self around not making that mistake again. He was holding a length of leather harness in one hand and looking at her the way you look at a bill you didn't expect. "Mr. Mercer," she said, "I'm Eliza Voss, from Harlow House. I have a letter." She held it out. He didn't take it. His eyes moved over her. Not unkind, exactly, but assessing in a way that had no warmth in it. She was aware of what he saw. A young woman in a worn coat, with a single bag, standing on his porch in the cold with her chin up, because that was the only thing she had to offer right now. "You worked a ranch before," he said. It wasn't a question. It was more like something he was reading off a list, checking against what was in front of him. "I worked at Harlow House," she said. "Cooking, cleaning, laundry, basic repairs." "I didn't ask about Harlow House." His voice was level. Not raised, not cruel, just factual. "I asked about ranch work, livestock. I asked about a person who could start on the north pasture fence before I had to show them what a fence post looks like." Eliza didn't look away. The letter said, "I know what the letter said." He did take it now, just to look at it, and the way his jaw shifted when he read it told her everything she needed to know about how accurately it described her. "It says you're experienced in livestock operations and general ranch maintenance." He folded it again and held it back out to her. "You're not." "No," she admitted. "I'm not." A long pause. The wind moved between them and rattled something against the eaves. "Then why did they send you?" She wanted to say, "Because I was convenient." Because I was an obligation they'd been looking for a way to end. Because nobody at Harlow House had asked what I could do, only what they could do with me. But she'd learned a long time ago that speaking the plain truth of a bad situation out loud too quickly gave the other person permission to dismiss you along with it. "Because I was available," she said, "and I will work harder than anyone they could have sent." He looked at her for a moment longer than was comfortable. Then he said, "I need someone who knows what they're doing, not someone who plans to learn on my time and my equipment and my livestock." "I understand that. I've got a cattle operation, a broken down north fence, and a horse that put my last hand in the hospital. I don't have time to—" "I understand," she said again, "but I have nowhere else to go." That stopped him. Not because it moved him, she thought. His face didn't change, but because it was the only honest thing that had been said since she arrived. And honesty, she was already learning, was a currency Wyatt Mercer could identify even when he'd rather not. He let out a short breath. "You eat yet?" "No." "There's food in the kitchen. You'll sleep in the bunkhouse. I'll decide in the morning." He stepped back. The door stayed open. She picked up her bag and walked in. The kitchen was at the back of the house, and it was the most human room she'd seen in the building. Not warm, exactly, but lived in. A cast iron stove that was putting out serious heat. A table built for 6 with only one chair pushed in at an angle from actual use. Shelves with actual variety on them. Dried beans, cornmeal, a crock of something she identified as lard, tins of peaches lined up with the labels facing out like someone had arranged them with care and then forgotten to stop caring about it. There was a pot of something already made, a bean stew with salt pork, and she ladled herself a bowl and sat down and ate it without ceremony. It was plain and it was hot, and it was the first real food she'd had since the railway station in the east, and she was grateful for it in a way that bypassed pride entirely. She heard him moving in another part of the house, not coming toward her, just existing nearby. When she'd finished eating, she washed the bowl and put it back where she found it. She took her bag and went to find the bunkhouse. The bunkhouse was a long, narrow building behind the barn with 4 bunks and a potbelly stove and hooks on the wall and nothing else. It smelled of other men's work, but the bunk closest to the stove had a clean blanket folded on it, which she chose to read as intentional. She lit the stove with wood and tinder from the box beside it, which she'd learned to do at Harlow House back when that knowledge seemed domestic and limited, rather than the kind of thing that could save you somewhere cold. She sat on the edge of the bunk with her hands on her knees in the dark, and the orange glow of the stove, and she let herself be afraid for exactly the length of time it took the fire to catch properly. Then she made herself lie down. Then she closed her eyes. Whatever was going to happen in the morning was going to happen whether she slept or not. She was up before the light. She didn't need anyone to tell her what to do. She'd spent 24 years in an institution run by schedules, and she'd absorbed them the way you absorb anything you can't avoid, completely, involuntarily, right down to the bone. She built the fire back up in the bunkhouse stove, washed her face with water from the barrel outside, laced her boots in the dark, and went to the barn. The barn was large and dim and smelling of hay and horses and the particular animal closeness that she'd never experienced before but found, to her own mild surprise, that she didn't mind. There were 4 horses in stalls along the left wall. Working horses, dun and roan, solid-looking animals who observed her with the mild curiosity of creatures accustomed to strangers. She found the feed bins. She found the measuring scoop hanging from a peg. She spent 20 minutes reading the schedule scratched in chalk on the wall near the door. Then she started feeding horses. She'd never fed a horse before in her life, but she'd fed things. She'd hauled and rationed and distributed food in a house full of children for years, and the principles were the same. You found the right amount. You delivered it to the right place. You did it consistently and without drama. She got through 3 stalls before she made a mistake, misjudged the distance on the second horse, and got her sleeve caught briefly on the stall latch. But she recovered and didn't make the same mistake on the third. She was moving feed sacks when Wyatt Mercer appeared in the barn doorway. He said nothing for a moment, just looked. "4th stall is Shadow," she said without turning around. "I didn't go near it." "Smart. Is the schedule on the wall accurate, or is it old?" He walked past her to check the stall she'd just done. He looked at the hay, looked at the water bucket she'd refilled, looked at the horse. "It's current," he said. "Who taught you to do this?" "Nobody. I read the schedule and applied logic." He turned and looked at her more directly. It was the same look from the night before, measuring, but with a different quality to it, like the calibration had shifted slightly. "Where'd you get the logic?" 20 years of making things work with half of what was needed." He stood there for a moment. Then he said, "There's a fence line needs checking on the north side. 3 posts are soft. You'll need a hammer and a post hole digger from the tool shed," he pointed. "I'll show you once. After that, it's yours." It wasn't an offer of employment, but it wasn't a dismissal either. She put down the feed sack and followed him to the tool shed. The post hole digger weighed somewhere around 12 pounds and was designed for a person with substantially more upper body experience than she had. She found this out during the first post, when she drove it into the ground at an angle that accomplished nothing useful and wrenched her shoulder in the process. She didn't make a sound. She pulled it out, adjusted her grip and her stance, and tried again. The second attempt was better. Not good, but better. Wyatt watched her for approximately 4 minutes, said nothing, and left. She understood that this was deliberate, that he was seeing whether she'd stop when nobody was watching or whether she'd keep going, and she was annoyed by how transparent it was, and then more annoyed at herself for caring what he thought instead of just doing the work. She did 5 posts. The first 2 were barely adequate. The third was better. By the 5th, she'd developed a rhythm that wasn't exactly efficient but was functional, and she was only moderately certain she'd pulled something in her right arm that she was going to feel for a week. When she came back to the barn at midday, there was a tin plate of food set on the workbench: bread, cheese, sliced cold meat. Nobody around. She sat down on an overturned bucket and ate. From the direction of the paddock, she heard the black horse. Not a whinny. Something shorter, harder. She'd heard the word scream used for horses in stories and dismissed it as melodrama. She reconsidered that now. Whatever Shadow did, it was a sound with edges in it, a sound that you felt somewhere behind your sternum. She found herself setting down the bread and listening. Then she made herself pick it up again and keep eating. She was not here to be distracted. She was here to still be standing at the end of the week. That first evening, when the light was going red and she was putting tools away in the shed, she heard voices. She paused, and through the shed wall she made out two of them, men talking near the barn, neither of them Wyatt. One had a low voice, the other had a laugh that came too easy. "Heard Mercer took in somebody new," low voice said. "Charity girl," Easy Laugh said. "Straight off a train from a poorhouse out east. Can't have ridden a horse in her life. You want to tell me what he figures he's going to do with that?" Low voice. "She's still here?" "Far as I know." "Give her a week." Easy Laugh. "You're generous. I give her 3 days. First time Shadow decides to introduce himself, she's going to run." She stood in the shed with her hand on the door handle and her heartbeat very steady, and she waited until they moved on. Then she put the last of the tools away in exactly the right places and walked back to the bunkhouse. She did not think about what they'd said. There was no profit in it. She thought about the 5th fence post instead, the one she'd gotten right, and what she needed to do differently on the first and second ones tomorrow to get them to the same standard. That night she discovered a blister on her palm the size of a silver dollar, and she pressed Clara's tin of salve into it and wrapped her hand with a torn piece of hem and went to sleep. Outside the bunkhouse, somewhere in the direction of the paddock, Shadow made his sound again in the dark. She lay there and listened to it and didn't pretend it wasn't frightening, and she didn't let it mean anything about whether she would stay. Both things could be true. She was learning that. You could be afraid and still be exactly where you needed to be. The wind came down off the hills and pressed against the bunkhouse walls, and she could feel the cold trying to find its way in through every gap and joint. But the stove was lit, and she'd lit it herself. She closed her eyes and let the night settle around her, and she did not dream of Harlow House or Sister Margaret's flat voice or the ledger that had contained her whole life in 2 lines of ink. She dreamed of a fence post going in straight and clean, and she woke up in the morning ready to do it again. The blister on her palm opened on the 3rd day. She was hauling water from the creek to the horse troughs, 2 buckets on a yoke that sat wrong across her shoulders no matter how she adjusted it. When she felt the skin give, a sharp wet sting that made her breath catch. She set the buckets down, looked at her hand, and felt a distant, almost clinical recognition. This was going to get worse before it got better, and there was nothing to do about it except wrap it tighter and keep going. She tore another strip from the hem of her second dress. The hem was getting ragged now, shortened by increments every time she needed something to bandage with, and she wound it around her palm and picked the buckets back up. She did not tell Wyatt. She understood by the 3rd day that telling Wyatt anything that could be read as complaint was the same as handing him a reason. He hadn't told her she could stay. He'd told her to work, and she was working, and that was the whole of the arrangement so far. It was fragile in the way that arrangements built entirely on performance are always fragile. One bad morning, one thing dropped, one moment where he looked at her and saw someone who was costing more than they were giving, and it would be over. She could not afford a bad morning. The 4th morning she overslept by 20 minutes. Not by much. But she came into the barn to find Wyatt already there, feeding the horses himself. And the look he gave her when she walked in, just a look, not a word, was worse than anything he could have said. She went straight to the feed room and took over without speaking, and he walked out, and neither of them mentioned it. She set her boots by the bunkhouse door every night after that, and put herself to sleep by counting backwards from 100, which was a trick she'd developed at Harlow House to get to sleep in a room full of restless children. It worked. She was up before the light. She did not oversleep again. What she did do, consistently and without meaning to, was learn. It happened the way anything happens when you pay close enough attention to something for long enough, gradually and then suddenly. She learned which of the working horses would take the bit without fuss, and which needed a moment of patience first. She learned that the water in the south trough went brackish faster than the north one, and needed changing every 2nd day instead of 3rd. She learned that the tool shed had a logic to it that wasn't immediately apparent. It looked like chaos, but Wyatt always put things back in the same places, and if you learned the places, you could find what you needed in the dark. She learned that he drank his coffee standing up at the kitchen window every morning for exactly as long as it took him to finish it, and that he was usually looking north toward the paddock while he did it. She didn't know what he was looking at. Not yet. The other men on the property came into focus slowly. There were two of them, day workers, she gathered, who didn't sleep on the ranch. A man named Pete, who was in his 50s with a bad knee that he walked around carefully, like it was something he was managing rather than suffering, and a younger man, maybe 19 or 20, who everyone called Dix and who had the particular energy of someone who'd learned early that being fast and loud was a decent substitute for being competent. Dix was the easy laugh from the shed wall. She'd identified that the second day when she heard him laugh at something Pete said and recognized the sound. Neither of them was overtly unkind to her. What they were was something more ordinary and in some ways harder to deal with. They treated her like she wasn't really there. They'd speak across her in the barn, ask each other where a tool was when she was standing right next to it, split the work between themselves at the beginning of a task without factoring her in, and then act mildly surprised when she'd already done a portion of it. Dick said to Pete one morning, just loudly enough that she was clearly meant to hear, "She's still here." Pete said, "Mm-hmm." 4 days, Dick said. "Mm-hmm," Pete said again, and didn't add anything else. Pete was harder to read than Dick's. He watched her in the way someone watches something they're trying to figure out, not dismissively, but without committing to any particular conclusion. She decided, early, that Pete was the one worth proving something to, not because his opinion mattered more than Dix's in any formal sense, but because Pete was paying actual attention. Dix's mockery was reflexive and cheap. Pete's reserve was considered, which meant if she earned his respect it would mean something. She kept working. On the 5th day, something shifted. She was repairing a section of fence on the east side of the property. The north pasture fence was her assignment, but she'd finished the assigned posts and moved east on her own because the boards there were clearly rotting and the whole structure would fail before spring if nobody addressed it. And Pete came to find her. He stood there for a moment looking at what she'd done, and he said, "Mercer asked you to do this part?" "No," she said, "but it needed doing." He looked at the fence for another moment. Then he said, "You missed 2 nails on the 3rd board." He pointed. "Wind gets under there, the whole section goes." She looked. I was right. She hadn't seen it. "Show me," she said. He looked at her then. Actually looked, not the reflexive glance she'd been getting. He took the hammer from her hand without ceremony and drove 2 nails in at the angle they needed to be to catch the grain properly. He handed the hammer back. "You hold it too far up the handle," he said. "Choke down more. You'll get more force, and you won't tire the shoulder." She adjusted her grip and tried it. The nail went in cleaner. She could feel the difference. "Thank you," she said. Pete nodded. He started to leave and then stopped. "The east fence," he said. "Mercer'll notice you went past your assignment." "I know. Some men don't like that." "I know that too." He looked at her a moment more. He might not say anything. "I know." And then Pete did something she hadn't expected. He almost smiled. It wasn't much, a very slight shift at the corner of his mouth. But it was there, and it was real, and he turned around and walked back toward the barn before she could read too much into it. She drove the rest of the nails at the lower grip position. Every one of them went in cleaner, shab. At the end of the 5th day, she was washing up at the outdoor water barrel when she heard Shadow. It was later than usual. The light was already going, and the sound was different from the ones she'd heard before. Not the hard, aggressive noise she'd come to associate with the morning hours, when he seemed to concentrate his fury in a particular way. This was longer and lower, something more like an extended complaint than a challenge, and it stopped and started in a rhythm that made her think of something she didn't have a word for. Not pain exactly, something more like... She dried her hands and walked toward the paddock. She knew she shouldn't. She'd made a point of not doing this. She had cataloged Shadow's existence from a distance. The black shape at the fence, the sounds through the bunkhouse wall, the way the air around that paddock felt different, slightly charged. But she'd kept herself from getting close because she understood that curiosity was a luxury she couldn't afford right now, not when every decision she made was still being weighed. She stopped at the outer fence, 10 feet from the paddock. Shadow was at the far end, and for a moment he didn't react to her presence. She could see him clearly. He was even larger than she'd registered from a distance, a horse that filled space differently than the working animals in the barn, carrying himself with something that was either aggression or grief, or possibly both. The marks on his flank were more visible now. She didn't know enough about horses to say what had made them, but she knew enough about marks to know they weren't recent. She stood very still. After a moment, Shadow lifted his head. He looked at her with one dark eye, and she looked back, and neither of them moved for the length of about 10 breaths. Then she said quietly and without thinking much about it, "I know. It doesn't make sense, any of it." Shadow's ear moved. He didn't come closer. He didn't move away. She stood there another minute and then walked back to the bunkhouse, because standing at the paddock fence in the dark was the kind of thing that could be seen from the main house window, and she hadn't earned the right to be strange yet. Wyatt saw her. He'd been at the window with his coffee going cold in his hand, which was not unusual. He spent a portion of every evening at that window without being entirely sure what he was watching for. When he caught her outline moving in the direction of the paddock, he watched her stop at the outer fence. He watched her stand there. He watched her walk back. He had employed 6 people in the past 2 years. He'd asked all of them at one point or another to keep away from Shadow's paddock, and without exception, every one of them had tested that instruction within the first week, getting close either out of bravado or curiosity, leaning on the fence, making sounds at the horse, trying to establish some kind of thing with him. Every single one of those attempts had ended the same way, with Shadow on his back feet and the person in question putting distance between themselves and the paddock. She hadn't tried to get close. She'd stopped at the outer fence. She'd stood still. Then she'd left. He didn't know what to do with that. He set the coffee cup down and went back to the accounts he'd been ignoring for a week, and he tried not to think about the fact that she'd moved to the east fence section without being asked, and that Pete had apparently spent 20 minutes showing her how to drive a nail correctly, which was the most time Pete had voluntarily spent showing anyone anything in 3 years. He didn't think about her hands either. He'd noticed the wrapped palm 2 days ago. He hadn't said anything because there was nothing to say. If she wasn't going to mention it, mentioning it himself would feel like something he wasn't prepared to be yet. He thought instead about the north pasture and the cattle count he needed to do before the week was out, and the fact that his water line from the creek had a joint that was starting to fail and would need to be replaced before the first hard freeze. He had a lot to think about. He thought about the wrapped palm anyway. Week 2 arrived the way second weeks at hard places always do, without ceremony and with the very clear message that the first week had been the easy part. The work expanded, not because Wyatt told her to do more, but because she could see what needed doing and her threshold for leaving things undone was extremely low. She mucked out the barn, all of it, not just the assigned stalls. She reorganized the feed room by size and frequency of use. She found a loose board on the bunkhouse roof that was letting weather in and fixed it with materials from the tool shed, which took her 3 attempts because she'd never been on a roof before, but the 3rd attempt held. She made mistakes. She made several. She gave a working horse the wrong ration one morning, mixed up the measurements from the chalk schedule, which she realized halfway through and corrected, but not before Wyatt had seen and not before she'd felt the specific sick drop of having done something careless with an animal that trusted you. She said nothing. She fixed it. She memorized the schedule more carefully. She also dropped a full bucket of water into the feed room, which soaked the bottom layer of a grain sack and would have meant waste if she hadn't caught it quickly enough to transfer the wet grain to a bucket for immediate use. She caught it quickly enough. Her heart didn't slow down for about 20 minutes after. Dick saw that one. She heard him start to say something to Pete and then stop, which was a different thing from before. On the 9th day, Wyatt handed her a new task. "I've got 20 head of cattle in the south pasture," he said. "I need a count done before the snow comes. You'll go out with Pete." She nodded. She didn't say she'd never counted cattle either, because at this point that seemed like a category of information that didn't need repeating. Pete was already at the gate with 2 horses saddled when she got there. He handed her the reins of a sorrel mare named Cora, who was, he said, patient. She mounted, not gracefully, but she got up, and they rode out. It was the first time she'd been on a horse's back. She found out, in the next 40 minutes, that riding was a coordination of things you couldn't really practice separately and then assemble at speed. You had to trust the animal, and you had to communicate through small adjustments that you couldn't intellectualize your way into. You had to feel them, and feeling them required giving up a certain amount of control, which was not something she came to naturally. Cora was patient, as advertised, and forgave her a lot. She still arrived at the south pasture with her thighs burning and her hands gripping the reins about 30% tighter than was necessary. Pete didn't comment on any of this. He just said, "Count goes by tens. Start at the left side of the herd. Work right. If you lose your place, start the nearest group over." "All right." "Cattle move. Don't try to hold them still. Move with them." "All right." They split, and she worked her way around the outside of the herd, counting in tens, and when she met Pete on the far side, she had 19. He had 19. They waited, recounted, and she found the 20th animal standing alone behind a scrub oak at the pasture edge, looking aggrieved. "Good eyes," Pete said. "I wasn't sure I was counting right." "You were," he said, and turned Cora back toward the gate. She rode behind him and let herself feel, quietly, and without showing it, something that was adjacent to satisfaction. It wasn't pride. It was simpler than that. It was the feeling of having done a thing that needed doing and having done it correctly. And that feeling had been one of the few reliable currencies of her life for as long as she could remember. She held on to it during the ride back, even when her thighs were complaining loudly enough that she had to make a deliberate effort to keep her face neutral. The thing about Shadow happened the way most difficult things happened, quietly, in the margins of other events, accumulating without announcing itself. She'd started going to the outer fence in the evenings. Not every evening, and not for long, 10 minutes, maybe 15. But she went, and she stood, and she spoke in a low voice about whatever was immediately present. The fence she'd repaired that day, the cattle count, the fact that the water in the south trough was brackish again. She wasn't trying to accomplish anything. She was simply being in the vicinity, consistently and without drama, because something she couldn't entirely explain told her that consistency was what that paddock had been missing. Shadow's reactions changed by increments so small she might have imagined them. The first week, he stayed at the far end of the paddock every time she appeared. By the second week, he'd moved to the middle third. He never approached the fence. He never acted as though her presence was welcome. But he stopped treating it as a threat. One evening, she was at the fence talking about the bunkhouse roof. The patch was holding through 2 nights of wind, which was a better result than she'd expected, when she heard footsteps behind her and turned to find Wyatt standing 10 feet back watching her. Neither of them spoke for a moment. "You're not supposed to be near this paddock," he said finally. His voice was flat. "I'm not inside it," she said. "I can see that." She waited, and he didn't say anything else, and she turned back to the paddock. Shadow was at the midpoint of the fence, watching them both. "What happened to him?" she asked. A long pause. "That's not your business." "I know." She kept her eyes on Shadow. "But I've been trying to understand what he is, and I can't figure it out from outside. He's not just mean. Mean horses are mean all the time. He's only like this sometimes. The rest of the time he's just quiet." Wyatt didn't answer. "Something made him this way," she said. Not accusing, just stating it. "Things make everything the way it is," Wyatt said, and she heard him walk away. She stood at the fence a few minutes more. Shadow watched her go when she left, which was new. It was Dix who brought it to a head on the 14th day, in the barn, in front of Pete and a man named Garrett, who came out from town occasionally to buy feed. She'd been cleaning tack, but the harness and bridles needed oil worked into the leather, which was tedious work, and also work that clearly hadn't been done in longer than it should have been. And she was focused on it when she heard Dix talking to Garrett in a voice pitched not quite low enough. "Charity case," Dix was saying, "straight off a poorhouse train. Don't know a horse from a fence post, but she's been out here learning on Mercer's time." Garrett said something she didn't catch. 2 weeks, Dix said. "She'll break. Shadow will see to that soon enough, I figure. She's been going to the paddock fence every night like she's got some kind of plan, like she thinks she's different from everyone else who's tried." She kept working the oil into the leather. "You ask me," Dix continued, "they sent her here because nobody else wanted her. Mercer got took. She'll realize she doesn't belong here about the same time he realizes he doesn't need her." She put the harness down. She stood up and she looked at Dix directly, and she said, with a steadiness that she was generating from somewhere below conscious thought, "Do you want to say that louder, or were you comfortable at that volume?" Dix turned. He'd expected, she could see it on his face, that she was going to keep her head down. That was what the previous 2 weeks had trained him to expect. "I wasn't talking to you," he said. "No," she said. You were talking about me to someone else, which is a different thing, and which I'd appreciate you stopped doing. Garrett had gone very still. Pete was doing something at the far end of the barn, and not looking over, but his hands had stopped moving. Dick squared himself up the way men did when they wanted to make their size part of the argument. You've been here 2 weeks. You don't get to tell me. I've been here 2 weeks working from before sunrise to after dark, she said. I fixed fence, counted cattle, cleaned this barn, and the tack in it that hadn't been oiled in what looks like 6 months. You can disagree with whether I belong here. That's your business. But you don't get to stand in this barn and tell someone else I'm worthless while I'm 10 feet away. That's not about what I've earned. That's just about what's decent. Silence. Dix looked at her. He looked at Garrett. He looked very briefly at Pete's back. He didn't say anything else. He picked up the thing he'd come in for and left the barn. Garrett cleared his throat and left shortly after. She sat back down and picked up the harness and went back to working oil into the leather, and her hands were completely steady, which she found somewhat remarkable. Pete came down the barn aisle about 5 minutes later and stopped next to her. He didn't look at her directly. He picked up a bridle from the peg above her head. 6 months, he said quietly. She looked up. The tack, he said. Closer to 8, actually. We've been short-handed. He paused. You got the oil worked in good on that near side cheek piece. She looked at the cheek piece in her hand. Thank you. He took the bridle and walked back to the other end of the barn. It wasn't an apology, and it wasn't a declaration, and it wasn't anything that could be pointed to or named, but it was something, and she understood what it was without needing to examine it too closely. She filed it next to the hammer lesson and the almost smile and went back to work. 3 days later, she rode Cora without Pete. Wyatt told her to take the east trail and check the condition of the creek crossing, which had been reported soft after the last rain. She rode out alone for the first time, and she gave herself permission to be nervous about this on the way out, and told herself she'd need to be done with that by the time she turned back. Cora moved steadily under her, and by the halfway point her grip on the reins had loosened to where it only needed to be. The creek crossing was soft. She got off, which she managed less gracefully than she'd hoped, tested the bank on both sides, identified the worst of the damaged sections, and rode back to report. She was factual. She told him what she'd seen. She gave him her best estimate of what needed doing, based on the fence repair experience she'd accumulated, which she knew was limited. He listened. He didn't tell her the estimate was wrong. He asked 2 questions about the depth of the soft sections, which she answered as accurately as she could. Then he said, "You can take Cora on your own when you need to." She didn't make anything of this in her face. "Thank you." He nodded and went back to what he'd been doing. She took Cora back to the barn and brushed her down carefully, starting at the neck and working back the way Pete had shown her. And Cora stood for it with the patience she'd been promised, and turned to look at Eliza once with a mild and completely uncommitted eye. And Eliza found herself talking to the horse quietly as she worked, saying nothing in particular, just filling the silence the way she filled it at Shadow's fence. She thought about the fact that she was getting better at this. Not good. She wasn't going to lie to herself about the distance between where she was and where she needed to be, but better, incrementally, in the particular way that only consistent daily effort produced. Her hands had stopped blistering, which meant the skin had toughened. Her shoulder didn't hurt anymore on the hammer. She could sit a horse for 2 hours without her whole lower body staging a complaint. She was still not the ranch hand the letter had claimed she was. But she was becoming something. She didn't let herself think too far past the immediate day, because thinking too far ahead at Harlow House had always been an exercise in disappointment. You learned what you needed for the season you were in, and you trusted that what came after would require something different, and you'd manage that when it arrived. It was not a romantic way to live, but it was an honest one, and it had served her. It served her now. That evening, she went to the paddock fence. The air had an edge to it that hadn't been there the week before, a promise of cold to come, the kind of cold that didn't apologize. She stood at the outer fence with her coat closed and her breath coming out white, and she talked about the creek crossing and the soft bank, and the way the water had been moving, which had seemed faster than expected for this time of year. Shadow moved toward the fence, not all the way. He stopped about 15 feet back. But he moved toward her, and he stood there, and she kept her voice level and kept talking, and he didn't leave. She walked back to the bunkhouse in the dark with her hands in her pockets, and the cold settling over the ranch like a second skin on everything, and she thought, something is changing here. She wasn't sure what it was yet. She wasn't sure what it would cost, but she could feel it the way you feel a weather shift before you see it, in the pressure of the air, in the way sound traveled differently, in the particular quality of the quiet. She let herself feel it and then put it away because tomorrow was a cattle move and she still wasn't entirely sure she could get Cora through a gate without embarrassing herself. And that was the more immediate problem. One thing at a time, one fence post, one nail, one day. She went to sleep and she did not think about what was coming, and the wind came down off the hills and the cold pressed closer, and somewhere in the dark the black horse stood at his fence and did not make any sound at all. The first hard freeze came on a Wednesday. Eliza knew it was coming because the air the night before had that particular stillness to it. Not calm, exactly, but held, like something waiting to exhale. She woke before her usual time and lay in the bunk listening to the silence and knew, without looking, that the ground outside had changed overnight. When she opened the bunkhouse door, her breath came out in a solid cloud, and the yard was pale with frost, every surface sealed under a thin glaze that caught the pre-dawn gray and held it. She built the fire higher than usual and went to the barn. The working horses were restless with the cold. Not dangerously so, just alert in a way they weren't on mild mornings, ears moving, feet shifting. She talked to them while she worked, the same low conversational nothing she'd developed at Shadow's fence, and it seemed to help. Cora pressed her nose against Eliza's shoulder briefly while she was filling the water bucket, and Eliza stood there for a moment and let her, because that kind of thing cost nothing, and meant more than it should. She was halfway through the morning feeding when Wyatt came into the barn, which was earlier than his usual time. He checked the stall latches, checked the water level in the south trough, looked at the frost on the barn roof. He had the expression he wore when he was calculating something. Not distant exactly, more like compressed, the way a man looks when a dozen variables are being processed simultaneously and none of them are coming out even. Creek crossing's going to ice at the edges, he said, not to her specifically, but clearly expecting her to respond. I checked it 3 days ago, she said. The soft sections we flagged had dried up some, but they were still low. Ice at the edges would make the crossing manageable, actually. It'd firm up the banks. He looked at her. If it doesn't go too deep. If it doesn't go too deep, she agreed. He almost said something else and didn't. He went back to checking the stalls. This was how they talked now. 2 weeks into the freeze preparedness rhythm that had taken over the ranch as October thinned out. In short, functional exchanges that covered what needed covering without wasting anything. She'd noticed that Wyatt didn't produce words he didn't need, and she'd adapted to that without planning to, partly because she respected the economy of it, and partly because silence on a ranch was never actually silence. It was full of other information, and you learned to read it. What she'd learned in the past 3 weeks, reading that silence, was that Wyatt Mercer was carrying something he'd been carrying a long time. She didn't know what it was. She only knew the shape of it, the way it showed up in the set of his shoulders when he stood at the main house window looking north, and the way he never went near Shadow's paddock himself, but never looked away from it either. She'd stopped asking. He'd made clear that asking was a door he wasn't opening, and she'd filed it in the category of things she had no right to yet, which was a large category with a lot in it. She was learning to be patient with that category. The cattle move that had worried her went better than she'd expected, which was not the same as going well. She lost her seat on Cora twice during the first push. Not completely, she caught herself both times, but it was close enough that she felt the particular cold embarrassment of almost failing publicly. Pete saw one of the recoveries and said nothing, which she was grateful for. Dick saw the other one and said nothing either, which surprised her until she understood that the barn conversation 3 days ago had done something she hadn't anticipated. Dick's had gotten quiet. Not friendly, not warm, just quiet. Like he'd recalculated something privately and arrived at a different figure. She'd take quiet. Quiet was workable. By the second push, she'd found something closer to the right balance on Cora. Lower in the seat, less gripping with her knees, trusting the horse to know where her feet were going, rather than trying to telegraph corrections for terrain. Cora could read better than she could. It wasn't skill yet, but it was the beginning of understanding what skill would feel like, which was its own kind of progress. Wyatt rode ahead for most of the move, and she watched him when she could without being obvious about it. There was a difference between the way he sat a horse and the way anyone else she'd seen sat a horse, including Pete, who was competent. Wyatt moved with the animal the way water moves with a grade, without negotiation, without apparent effort, the adjustments so small they were invisible from the outside. She stored that observation. She couldn't replicate it yet, but she filed it. When they got the cattle counted and settled in the winter pasture, Pete dismounted near the gate and said to her, "You stayed on." "Barely," she said. "Barely counts," he said. She was fairly sure that was the nicest thing he'd said to her directly since she arrived. It was the last week of October when she came the closest she'd come to leaving. Not because of anything Wyatt said or did. Not because of Dix, who had settled into a kind of watchful neutrality that she'd stopped expecting to become anything more. It was because of a letter. She found it in the pocket of her second dress when she was doing laundry. A letter from Clara, the girl from Harlow House, who'd pressed the tin of salve into her hands at the station, which she'd written while Eliza was still on the train east and sent to Raven Hollow on the assumption she'd arrive. The letter had been in her dress pocket since she'd picked up her mail from the town post office on the one trip she'd made in with Pete for supplies, and she'd told herself she'd read it when she had time, and then she'd kept not making time, and now she was sitting with her hands wet and the letter in front of her, and she read it. Clara was doing well. Clara had found a position in a house in town. A real town, back east, with streets and a millinery and neighbors. She was learning to cook for a proper household. She had a room to herself. She wanted to know if Eliza was all right. At the bottom, in different ink, like she'd come back to it after. "They already sent someone else to your room. I don't say that to be unkind. I say it so you know you can't come back to what was here." Eliza sat with the letter for a long time. She sat with what it cost to hear that the space she'd occupied had been filled without ceremony, without interval, because she had always been a space to fill rather than a person in it. She sat with the specific ache of Clara's room and Clara's practical kindness, and the fact that in the geography of Harlow House there was now no inch of ground that had her name on it. She didn't cry. She hadn't cried since she was 14 and had decided, after a particular bad stretch, that crying was a withdrawal from a bank account she couldn't afford to run low on. What she did instead was sit very still for about 10 minutes and feel the full weight of it without flinching, because flinching didn't make it lighter, it just made you afraid of how heavy it was. Then she folded the letter and put it back in her pocket and went back to the laundry. But something had shifted. Not broken, not cracked. She was too careful for that. But the thing she'd been holding at arm's length for the past 3 weeks, the question of whether this was real, and whether it would last, and whether she was building something or just delaying an ending, came closer. She couldn't hold it at arm's length anymore. That evening she went to Shadow's fence, and she didn't talk. She just stood there, and he came to the middle of the paddock the way he'd started doing, and they looked at each other in the cold, and she thought, this is what I have. This ranch, these animals, this cold, this man who doesn't waste words, and this horse that doesn't trust anyone. This is the ground under my feet. It was not soft ground, but it was ground. November arrived and the work changed character. Summer ranch work was about outward expansion, fences and pastures and distances. Winter ranch work turned inward. The barn, the water lines, the feed stores, the business of keeping animals alive in cold that could kill them if you got careless for a day. Eliza had been good at outward work. She found she was better at inward work. She had a natural methodical quality that fit the rhythms of the barn, checking every water bucket twice, monitoring feed consumption, catching the early signs of a horse going off its food before it became a crisis. She caught one, the 3rd week of November. A roan gelding named Brick, Pete's preferred working horse, had been eating less for 2 days, and she'd been tracking it without saying anything because she wasn't sure yet whether she was reading it right. On the 3rd day, she was sure enough to say something. She found Wyatt in the tool shed and said, "Brick's off his feed 3rd day. He's drinking fine, but the hay consumption's down by about 1/3, and he's not taking his grain." Wyatt put down what he was doing and went to the barn with her. He looked at Brick, ran his hands down the horse's legs, checked his gums, stood back and watched him for a moment. "How long have you been watching this?" he asked. 2 days? I wasn't certain until this morning." He didn't say anything immediately. Then, "You should have told me on day 1. "I didn't know on day 1. I had a feeling and I wanted to be sure before I said something." He looked at her. "On this ranch, a feeling about an animal is worth saying." She filed that. I'll remember. He had Pete check on Brick twice that day and adjusted the feed, and by the following morning the horse was eating normally. It was probably a minor digestive thing, Wyatt said. It might have resolved on its own, but it might not have, and finding it early was the difference between an inconvenience and a loss. And he said that to her directly, which was the closest thing to a compliment he'd offered since she'd arrived. She went back to the bunkhouse that night and ate the meal she'd heated on the pot-belly stove. She'd taken to cooking for herself in the evenings rather than going to the main house kitchen, both because it gave her more time in the barn and because Wyatt's kitchen felt like a space she hadn't been invited to claim. And she thought about what he'd said. A feeling about an animal is worth saying. She thought about what that meant coming from someone who ran everything through a filter of evidence and practicality. It meant he'd started factoring in her observations as data. It meant something in how he was reading her had changed. She didn't make too much of it. She'd learned the cost of making too much of things. She was repairing the south water line when she found out about Thomas. It wasn't Wyatt who told her. It was Pete, and Pete didn't exactly tell her. It came out sideways, the way difficult truths often did, in the middle of something else. They were working on the water line together, replacing the joint that Wyatt had identified as failing back in October. It was cold enough that the ground had to be chipped at before it would give anything up, and they were taking turns with the pickaxe, which was the kind of work that produced conversation because silence left too much room for thinking about how cold your hands were. Pete said, without preamble and without looking up from what he was doing, "You know why the stallion's still here?" It wasn't a question. She said, "No." "Wyatt's brother tried to break him," Pete said. "About 2 years ago. Thomas was—" He stopped, worked the joint loose with a wrench. "He was 22, good with horses. Better than most men I've seen, actually. Thought he could get through to Shadow when nobody else could." Another pause. "He couldn't." She stood very still with the pickaxe in her hands. "Shadow threw him," Pete said. "Dragged him. By the time Wyatt got there—" He didn't finish that sentence. He didn't need to. Thomas died 3 days later, never came back to himself in between. The cold seemed to get colder. "And the horse," she said. "Wyatt couldn't put him down," Pete said. "Don't ask me to explain it. I've tried to understand it for 2 years and I can't get there. He just kept him." He finally looked up. "Some men, when something costs them everything, they can't let go of the thing that cost them, because letting go would mean it was over and they're not ready for it to be over." She thought about the window, the north-facing window in the main house, where Wyatt stood every evening with his cold coffee, looking at the paddock. "Does he know I go to the fence?" she asked. "He knows everything that happens on this property," Pete said. She picked up the pickaxe and went back to work and didn't say anything else, and neither did Pete. But the conversation sat inside her for the rest of the day and into the evening, rearranging things. Not changing what she thought about Shadow or about the fence visits, but putting them in a context that made them heavier, more consequential. She went to the fence that evening anyway. She stood in the cold with her breath coming out white and Shadow at his usual spot 15 feet from the fence line, and she talked to him quietly. She told him she knew about Thomas. She didn't know whether horses understood language. She suspected they didn't. Not the specific content of it, but responded to something underneath the words. But it seemed important to say, to acknowledge what had happened on the ground she was standing on. Shadow came 2 steps closer. Not to the fence, but closer than he'd been before. She stood very still and kept her voice even and talked until he moved back to his usual spot, and then she went in. "Well, Wyatt was in the barn when she came through on the way back to the bunkhouse, and he was doing something she'd never seen him do before. He was sitting on an overturned crate in the aisle, not working, just sitting. He had a piece of leather harness in his hands, but he wasn't doing anything with it, and the way he was holding it reminded her of something she didn't want to name. She should have kept walking. She knew that. She stopped anyway. "Pete told me," she said. He looked up. His face didn't change, but something behind it did. A tightening, a closing, the kind of expression that preceded someone telling you it wasn't your business. Before he could say it, she said, "I'm not going to pretend I don't know. That would be disrespectful to both of us." A long pause. "What did he say?" "He said Thomas was 22 and good with horses, and that Shadow threw him. He said you couldn't put the horse down after." Wyatt looked back at the piece of harness in his hands. He turned it once. "Pete talks too much." Pete talks exactly the right amount, she said. He told me what I needed to know so I'd stop seeing things wrong. Another pause, longer. And now you see them, right? I see them differently, she said. I don't know if I see them right yet. He was quiet for a moment. She waited, because she'd learned that with Wyatt, silence after a statement sometimes produced more than a direct question would. Thomas thought Shadow was like him, Wyatt said finally. His voice had a quality she hadn't heard in it before. Flatter, older, like something that had been pressed under weight for a long time. Thought if he was patient enough and steady enough, the horse would come around. I told him to wait. I told him the horse wasn't ready. He stopped. He didn't wait. She didn't say anything. I was in town, Wyatt said. I'd left him here because I trusted him, because he was... He stopped again. This time it took longer. He was the better one of us, with people and animals both. Everyone liked Thomas. Nobody just liked me. He said it without self-pity, just as a plain accounting of facts. I figured if he wanted to work with the horse, he probably knew something I didn't. But he didn't. He knew a lot, Wyatt said. Just not enough. And I wasn't here. The barn was quiet. One of the horses shifted in a stall. The wind pressed against the roof. You kept the horse because getting rid of him would have felt like admitting it was the horse's fault, she said, and you don't think it was. He looked at her then, and the look was not comfortable. It was the look of a person who has had something they've been unable to articulate given back to them in words, which is a particular kind of exposure. Go to bed, Eliza, he said. She went. But she lay in the bunk for a long time, looking at the ceiling while the stove ticked and the cold pressed at the walls, and she thought about what he'd said and what he hadn't said, and what it cost a person to carry guilt that was also love, because that was what it was. What he felt about Thomas and what he felt about Shadow were the same thing, fused together so completely that he couldn't release one without releasing the other, and he wasn't ready. She thought about whether anyone could ever be ready for something like that. She thought about the way Shadow had taken 2 steps toward the fence. She thought about a lot of things. And by the time the stove had burned down to coals, she'd arrived somewhere she hadn't planned on arriving. She understood for the first time that she was not just staying on this ranch to prove something about herself. She was staying because something here needed her to stay. She couldn't have said exactly what that something was. But it was real, and it was pulling, and she wasn't ready to let go of it either. The day Wyatt left for town was in the 2nd week of December, a Thursday, and he told her the night before that he had business at the land office and a meeting with the bank and wouldn't be back until the following morning. He ran through the list of what needed doing: feeding schedule, water checks, a repair on the north bunkhouse pipe that was starting to drip. And she took it all in and said she had it, and he looked at her with that measuring look that she'd stopped finding uncomfortable weeks ago and nodded once, and that was that. She did everything on the list, in order, without difficulty. It was the afternoon she hadn't planned for. She'd done the waterline repair. The drip had been simple enough, a washer that needed replacing, and she'd found the washer box in the tool shed and done it in 20 minutes. And the barn work was finished, and the feed was checked, and there was an hour of light left in the day that didn't have a task assigned to it. She stood in the barn aisle, and she felt the hour of unassigned time around her, and she knew, in a way that was below decision, where she was going. She'd told herself 100 times that she would never go inside that paddock. The fence visits were one thing, consistent, non-threatening, carefully maintained at the level of presence without encroachment. Going inside was something else entirely. Going inside was what Thomas had done. Going inside was the thing that everyone, including the part of her that was sensible and wanted to still be alive in the morning, agreed was not something she should do. She walked to the paddock. Shadow was at the far end, which was where he was most of the time now during daylight. He'd started coming closer in the evenings, when she came to talk, but the daytime behavior hadn't changed. He had his back partially to her, which she'd learned to read as not a relaxed posture, but not a maximally alert one. She put her hands on the fence rail and stood there for a long moment. She thought about Pete saying, "Some men, when something costs them everything, can't let go of the thing that costs them." She thought about Wyatt in the barn with the piece of harness in his hands, not working, just holding it. She thought about Thomas, who had been 22 and patient and had not waited. She was not going to make Thomas's mistake. She was not going into that paddock with a halter or a lead rope or any idea of getting something accomplished. She was going in because she thought, she believed, she couldn't say why, that what Shadow needed more than skill or technique or anyone's idea of breaking was the same thing she'd been offering from the fence line: simple, consistent, undramatic presence. A person standing in his space without demand. She told herself this. She examined it for the ways it could be wrong. She couldn't find a place where it was definitely wrong. She unlatched the gate. The sound of the latch was not loud, but Shadow heard it. His head came up and he turned, and she watched his body shift from the not maximally alert posture to something else. A tightening, a charging of the air around him, his ears going forward and flat in rapid alternation. She pushed the gate open slowly. She stepped inside. She left the gate open behind her. Shadow exploded. There was no other word for it. The transition from stillness to motion was instantaneous and total, like something detonating. He came off his back feet with a sound that wasn't a sound she had words for, and his front hooves came down, and he charged, not directly at her, but angled, a half-charge that was a test or a warning or both. And she did the thing she'd told herself she'd do. She did not run. She stood her ground and made herself as small as she could without stepping backward. And the horse pulled up 10 feet away with his sides heaving and his head high, and every inch of him radiating something enormous and dangerous and frightened. They looked at each other. Her heart was doing something her ribs had not been designed to accommodate. She kept her breathing steady by force of will that she was fairly sure she'd never had occasion to call on at this volume before. "I'm not going to do anything," she said. Her voice came out level. She didn't know how. "I'm just here," Shadow screamed. That's the only word, the sound from the bunkhouse wall amplified by being inside the same space as it, and rose, and when his front hooves came back down, they hit the ground close enough that she felt the impact through the soles of her boots. She staggered. She didn't fall. She took one step sideways and not backward, which was a distinction that felt important and also possibly insane, and she said again, "I'm not going to do anything. I'm just here." He charged again, a full charge this time, and she threw herself sideways and hit the fence rail and felt it drive into her hip and back with a force that knocked the breath out of her, and she was on the ground. The world tilted, cold dirt against her palms, the sound of hooves. She was trying to get her breath back and not succeeding, and thinking, with a clarity that was probably shock, that she had miscalculated and that Pete was going to find her by the fence, and it was going to be exactly what Dix had predicted, and she had been wrong. She heard the gate. Not the paddock gate she'd come through, a different gate, the outer fence gate, the one she kept hearing but was only processing now. Boots hitting the ground running. She got one arm under herself. Wyatt came over the fence rail. She didn't see it. She was still working on getting upright. But she heard him, the particular sound of someone who moves without hesitation when moving without hesitation is what's needed. He got between her and Shadow, and his voice came out in something she'd never heard from him before. Loud, hard, specific, a series of sharp commands that weren't words so much as sounds, tuned to a frequency that animal instinct responded to, and Shadow pulled back. She got herself up onto one knee. Wyatt turned to her, took her arm, and got her the rest of the way to standing without a word. He got her through the gate. He latched it. Then he looked at her. The thing she'd thought she understood about his face, the compression, the flatness, the controlled surface of it, was gone. What was there instead was something she'd seen in the faces of people at their absolute end of what they could hold together, and she understood all at once that it was not anger. It was fear. It was the particular expression of a person who has just seen something they've already lost once appear in front of them again. "What in God's—" he started, then stopped. His jaw worked. "What were you doing?" "I thought—" "What were you doing in there, Eliza?" She looked at him. Her hip was sending up notifications that she was going to need to sit down soon. Her hands were dirty. She had mud on the knees she'd gone down on. None of this seemed like the right thing to lead with. "I thought presence was what he needed," she said, without agenda. "I thought if someone just went in and stood there and didn't ask for anything—" "You thought wrong," he said, and his voice cracked on the last word in a way that she didn't think he'd intended, and that she was going to pretend she hadn't heard. "I know," she said. "You're right. I was wrong." He stared at her. He looked like he was trying to find where to put the rest of what was in him. "You could have been killed," he said. "I know." "Thomas—" He stopped. She waited. He turned away from her. He put his hand on the paddock fence and stood there with his back to her, and she watched his shoulders and the way he was breathing, and she understood that something had just broken open in him that he'd been keeping sealed for 2 years, and it was not her place to try to close it back up again. She stood behind him in the cold, and she let him have the moment, all of it, however long it took. After a while she said quietly, "I came back from town early," he said, still not turning around. "I forgot a document. I came back and you weren't in the barn and the paddock gate was open." A pause. "I ran." "I know," she said. "I heard you. Don't do that again." "I won't." Another long pause. The cold had found its way inside her coat now, and her hip was making its case more insistently, and she thought she might have a bruise the size of a dinner plate by morning. He turned back around finally. He looked at her knee, at her hands, at what she imagined was the general state of someone who'd just been on the ground in a horse paddock, and the hard line of his face was still not quite back to where it usually was. There was something less armored in it. She couldn't say whether it would last. "Come inside," he said. "Your hands need looking at." She thought about saying she was fine and going to the bunkhouse. She decided against it. "All right," she said. They walked to the main house in the last gray light of the afternoon, and she was aware that this was new territory in a dozen different ways, and she filed all of them away without looking at them too directly, because the moment was already carrying enough, and she didn't need to add to its weight. Behind them, in the paddock, Shadow made his sound in the dark, shorter this time, less like fury and more like something that had exhausted itself and was now just present, just breathing, just there. She heard it. She kept walking. The kitchen in the main house was warmer than she'd expected. She'd only been inside it that first night. The bowl of bean stew, the careful washing up, the deliberate not claiming of any space that wasn't offered. And since then she'd kept herself to the bunkhouse and the barn and the working parts of the property, the places where her presence had a clear functional justification. Walking back in now, with mud on her knee and her hands still shaking slightly from adrenaline, she hadn't finished processing, felt different. The kitchen felt different too, less neutral, more like a room where someone actually lived. Wyatt went to the cabinet beside the stove without asking her to sit, and she sat anyway, on the same chair she'd used that first night. The one pushed at an angle from actual use, which she now understood was his chair. She moved to pull another one out from the table, and he said, without turning around, "Stay there." She stayed. He brought a tin box to the table. Inside it, a roll of clean cloth, a small bottle of something that smelled medicinal, a pair of tweezers, and a flat cake of something waxy she identified after a moment as the same kind of salve Clara had given her, now mostly gone from her own tin. He sat down across from her and looked at her hands. "Give me your right one," he said. She put it on the table. He looked at it the way he looked at everything, without rushing, taking in what was actually there rather than what he expected to find. The blisters from the first weeks had hardened into calluses. There was a scrape across the heel of her palm from the fence rail, dirt worked into it, and one of the older calluses had split at the edge. He cleaned it without ceremony and without being unnecessarily rough, which she noted. The medicinal stuff stung, and she didn't make a sound. He applied the salve and wrapped the palm in cloth and tied it off with the particular efficiency of someone who'd done this for injured animals so many times that the technique had become unconscious. "Left," he said. She put it on the table. Less damage on that one. He cleaned it anyway. While he was working, she looked at the shelves. The tins of peaches still lined up with their labels facing out, a detail she'd registered that first night, and which now, 3 months later, struck her differently. There was something in the consistency of it. Someone who arranged things that carefully and kept arranging them that way was someone who found steadiness in small repetitions, who built a life out of accumulated small habits, because the larger structure had failed at some point, and this was what remained. She understood that better than she would have 3 months ago. "You should have told me," he said, not looking up from her hand, "if you were going to do something like that. You weren't here. I mean before. Any of the times you were thinking about it." She looked at the top of his head. "How do you know I was thinking about it?" He was quiet for a moment. "Because you've been going to that fence every night for 6 weeks. Because I watched you slow down at that paddock gate every single time you walked past it." He tied off the wrap on her left hand. "You weren't going to stop at the fence forever. I know that. I just thought I had more time. She sat with that. More time to do what? He put the materials back in the tin box in the order he'd taken them out. He closed the lid. He set the tin aside. He did all of this without looking at her. Tell you about Thomas, he said. Myself. In my own time. The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, the wind had picked up, pressing against the walls with a low register sound that she'd gotten used to in the bunkhouse, but that felt different in here, inside the main house, inside the room where someone had arranged peach tins with the labels facing out. Pete told me the outline, she said. The facts. Pete doesn't know all of it. I know, she said. I could tell. He finally looked up. His face had resettled from the cracked open state it had been in at the paddock, but it hadn't returned all the way to its usual surface. There was something unguarded in it still, a quality of having spent something he didn't have in excess. It made him look older and more human at the same time. Thomas used to talk to him, Wyatt said. Shadow, same way you do. I'd watch from the window and think, that's going to go wrong. That horse has something in him that isn't going to be talked around. I told Thomas. He heard me, and he didn't listen, because Thomas had never found an animal he couldn't eventually reach, and he figured this was the same. He stopped. His hands were flat on the table, still. I was right about the horse, and wrong about everything else. Being right about the horse doesn't feel like it counts for much. She didn't say anything. After Thomas, he said, and stopped again. I thought about putting Shadow down for about 3 weeks. I had the rifle out twice. Both times I walked out there and I looked at him and I couldn't do it. He looked at his hands. I've tried to understand why. I still don't entirely understand it. Pete's version is probably as close as anyone's gotten. You couldn't end it, she said, because ending it would have meant making a decision about what the horse was. And if the horse was just dangerous, then Thomas died for nothing. And if the horse was reachable, then Thomas was right, and the only thing that went wrong was the timing. He looked at her. That look again. The calibration shifting. I've lived with it being unresolved, he said. That's what I mean when I say I don't understand why I kept him. It wasn't a decision. It was the inability to decide. That is a decision, she said. It's just not a clean one. He was quiet for a moment. No, he said. It isn't. The wind found a gap somewhere and moved through the house. She felt it at her ankles, brief and cold, and then it was gone. The stove ticked. What you did today was reckless, he said. You know that. I know. You could have been killed the same way Thomas was killed. I know that too. Then why? He stopped, restarted. Why did you think you could do what nobody else could? She thought about how to answer this honestly. I didn't, she said. I don't think I can do what nobody else could. I think I'm doing something different from what everyone else tried. Thomas wanted to reach him. Everyone who's gone near that horse wanted something from him. I wasn't going in there to get anything. I was going in there to just be there. To be something that didn't have an agenda. She paused. I might be completely wrong. Today was not a good argument for my being right. But the idea itself, I don't think the idea is wrong. He looked at her for a long time. You're hip, he said. She'd forgotten that he'd seen her hit the fence rail. It's fine. It's not, he said, in a tone that wasn't arguing so much as correcting. You hit that rail hard. You're going to be stiff tomorrow. I've been stiff before. There's liniment in the cabinet, same one I use for the horses. Don't tell Pete I told you that. He thinks it's only for animals, and he's probably right, but it works. He stood up. You'll sleep in the house tonight. She looked up. I'm fine in the bunkhouse. The bunkhouse stove has a cracked firebox. I've been meaning to fix it for a week. In this cold, with that hip, you're sleeping in the house. He said it with the same flatness he used for everything that was settled and not up for renegotiation. There's a room at the end of the hall. It's got a bed and a stove, and it's not the bunkhouse. She could have argued. She chose not to. All right, she said. He nodded. He went to the stove and did something with the damper that she filed for future reference, and he put the kettle on without asking her if she wanted anything, and she sat at his chair at his table in his kitchen and didn't feel, for the first time since Sister Margaret had pushed the paper across the desk, that she was occupying space on borrowed time. She slept 12 hours. She didn't intend to. She got into the bed in the room at the end of the hall, a narrow, iron-framed bed with a quilt that smelled of cedar and long storage. and the combination of warm room, physical exhaustion, and the particular aftermath of sustained adrenaline pulled her under before she'd finished her first thought. She woke to light at the wrong angle and lay there for a moment calculating, and then sat up fast because the light said mid-morning, and mid-morning meant the feeding schedule had passed without her. Her hip corrected this urgency by sending a signal so comprehensive that she sat back down on the edge of the bed and spent 30 seconds simply breathing. The bruise was spectacular. She checked it, a purple-black spread across her hip and lower back that looked worse than it felt, which was saying something because it felt like she'd been kicked by something large, which was not far from accurate. She moved carefully. Everything worked. Nothing was broken. She would be moving slowly today, but she would be moving. When she came out into the hall, she heard sounds from the barn, familiar sounds, the sounds of the morning feeding being done. She stood in the hallway and processed this and went to the kitchen. There was coffee on the stove, hot, recent. There was also bread on the table and a covered plate that turned out to hold eggs and salt pork, still warm. She sat down and ate. Halfway through the eggs, she heard Boots on the porch, and Wyatt came in, and he looked at her and then at the mostly empty plate and said, "Feeding's done. Pete came early." "You told him?" "I told him you'd had an accident with the fence rail," which is true. She appreciated that framing. "Thank you." He poured himself coffee and sat down at the other chair. Not her chair, the other one, which was his chair, and which she realized she'd displaced him from last night without knowing it. She started to offer to move, and he shook his head slightly before she said anything. "How's the hip?" "Functional," she said. "Colorful." Something moved at the corner of his mouth. Not a smile, not quite, but the architecture of one. "Use the liniment. I left it on the cabinet in the hall." "You didn't have to do all of this," she said. "I know." He drank his coffee. "I was already up." She looked at him. He was looking at his cup. Outside, Pete's voice said something to Dick's across the yard. She could hear the words, something about the North Water Line, and the ordinary sound of the ranch going about its morning work came through the kitchen walls. And it occurred to her that this was the first time she'd been inside the main house while the day was already in progress, and that it sounded like this, like something real and continued and sufficient. "I'm going back to the fence today," she said. He looked up. "Not inside the paddock," she said. "The fence. I'm not stopping the fence visits. I want you to know that." A pause. He set the cup down. "Eliza, what happened yesterday wasn't the fence. The fence is working. He's been coming closer for a month. You've seen it from the window." She kept her voice even. "I made a mistake in the timing and the method, not in the principle. I went in too soon without enough preparation. I know that." She paused. "But I'm not stopping." He looked at her for a long time. "I know you're not," he said finally. She hadn't expected that. "Then why do you look like that?" "Like what?" "Like a man trying to find a way to stop something he knows he can't stop." He picked up his cup again. He was quiet for a moment. "Because I know what that horse can do. I've known it for 2 years, and I've had to keep knowing it every day, and now I have to watch someone else." He stopped. His jaw worked. "It's not the same as Thomas," he said, and she understood that he needed to say that, needed to draw the line between what this was and what that had been. "I know it's not the same. You're not Thomas. What you're doing isn't what he did. But I can't—" He stopped again, restarted. "I'm not built for watching someone I—" Another stop. The sentence went somewhere he apparently wasn't ready to take it. The kitchen was very quiet. "Someone you what?" she said, not because she needed him to finish it. She understood what the sentence contained, but because she thought he needed to try. He looked at her. He set the cup down. He said, "Someone I don't want to lose," and said it with the flatness of a man stating a fact that embarrassed him, which made it more honest than anything ornate would have been. She looked back at him and felt something settle in her chest. Not dramatically, not in a way that changed the room, just a quiet internal adjustment, like a door that had been ajar closing softly to its frame. "You won't," she said. He nodded once. "I didn't say anything else about it." He stood up and took his cup to the sink and rinsed it, and she finished the eggs, and the morning went on. She went to the fence that afternoon, as promised. Her hip made the walk slower than usual, and she was aware of Wyatt's window in the way she was always aware of it. A passive awareness, not performance, just knowing. Shadow was at the far end when she arrived. She put her hands on the rail and stood in the cold and talked about the eggs this morning and the quality of the light and the sound. Pete's voice had made carrying across the yard. Shadow turned to look at her after about 5 minutes. After 10 minutes, he moved to the middle of the paddock. After 15, he was at the 20-foot mark, closer than he'd been since the day before, which she wouldn't have predicted. She kept her voice low and steady and watched him with peripheral vision rather than direct attention, because she'd discovered that direct attention read as challenge and peripheral attention read as something else, as coexistence maybe, as two things sharing space without negotiation. She went back to the house for the liniment and the hip and the narrow bed with the cedar quilt, and she slept better than she had in months. December deepened and the ranch reorganized itself around winter completely. The rhythm was different from the fall, more interior, more repetitive, the kind of work that built a specific endurance, not the physical endurance of new muscles, but the mental endurance of doing the same critical things the same careful way every single day. Because consistency in winter was the difference between animals that made it through and animals that didn't. She was good at consistency. It turned out to be one of her actual native skills, not something she'd learned, but something she'd always been. And in this context, it was worth more than most of what she'd built in the first weeks. She was also, and this surprised her slightly, becoming good at reading Wyatt. Not in the sense of predicting him, he was not a predictable man, but in the sense of understanding his language. He communicated primarily in action and occasionally in very compressed statement, and both required a literacy she'd been developing without knowing she was developing it. She could tell from the way he checked the south fence whether something had been worrying him about it for days. She could tell from the way he stood at the window whether the looking was routine or the looking was grief. She'd stopped filling silence he intended to keep and started distinguishing it from silence he would have welcomed a word into, which was a harder skill than it sounded. In return, and she noticed this without drawing attention to it, he'd started including her in decisions. Not in a formal way. Not as though she'd been promoted or designated. Just practically, he'd say, standing at the barn door looking at the weather. I'm thinking the cattle need to move to the east pasture before the week's out. What's the water situation over there? And she'd answer with what she'd actually observed, and he'd factor it in. She was asked for her reading of Brick's feed consumption during a week when the horse was sluggish again. She was asked which section of North Fence she'd rate as most urgent come spring. She answered all of it with what she actually knew, including the limits of what she actually knew, and he received it that way, as data from a source he'd assessed as reliable, used in the appropriate proportion. She understood this was a significant thing, in its quiet way. She didn't make a show of understanding it. The men from Doyle Creek Ranch arrived on a Friday in the third week of December. There were 3 of them, and she knew before she knew anything about them that they were the kind of men who came onto other people's property with a certain posture, the posture of people accustomed to their arrival being an event, to rooms and yards reorganizing themselves in response to their presence. They rode into the Raven Hollow yard at midday, and she was at the barn door when they came in, and she watched them register her and then look past her for Wyatt with the particular efficiency of people who'd already decided she wasn't relevant. Wyatt came out of the main house and met them in the yard. She stayed at the barn door because her work wasn't finished, and because the yard was Wyatt's business. She could hear the conversation without trying to. The cold carried voices well. The man in front was named Calloway. She gathered this from context. He had a wide-brimmed hat and a coat that cost more than her entire wardrobe and spoke the way certain men spoke, with the easy unhurriedness of someone who had never had to earn the right to take up time. He was complimenting the ranch in the particular way that is not really a compliment, noting that the fences looked better than expected, that the cattle count he'd heard about was solid, that it seemed like Wyatt was managing well under the circumstances. Wyatt was not warming to this. She could tell from his posture, which was its usual compressed self, but with an additional quality, a stillness that was less patient and more watchful. Then Calloway said, looking toward the barn. Looking at her, she understood, with the particular casualness of a man pretending to be casual. Heard you took on some help from a charity house. Wyatt said, I did. Worked out all right, has it? Pause. Yes. Calloway made a sound. Funny business hiring that way. No offense meant, I just wouldn't have figured you for the charitable type. The easy laugh of a man who finds himself funny. Girl from a poor house, no experience, I'd have thought you'd have sent her back inside a week. Seems like more trouble than it's worth. She was still at the barn door. Pete was somewhere behind her. She'd heard him come up while they were talking. Wyatt said, in a voice that was very flat and very clear, Eliza Voss has worked this ranch since October. She's repaired fencing, managed the livestock feeding program, identified a health issue in one of my working horses before it became a loss. And she can take Cora across the East Trail in rough conditions and bring back an accurate field report. A pause. That's not charitable. That's employed. A brief silence. Calloway said with a slightly different calibration now, less easy. Didn't mean any offense. None taken, Wyatt said, in a tone that drew a clear line between that statement and whether it was true. She turned away from the barn door and went back to the stall she'd been cleaning. Pete came up beside her and took the other side of the stall without being asked, and they worked in silence for a moment, and then Pete said, very quietly, Calloway's had his eye on the south parcel of this ranch for 3 years. She looked over. Comes around twice a year with a different reason, Pete said. That's not courtesy. That's surveying. She filed that. Does Wyatt know? Pete gave her a look that communicated, without cruelty, that this was not a question that needed an answer. She went back to work. The Doyle Creek men left about an hour later. She heard them go. She heard Wyatt come back into the yard and stay there for a moment. The particular silence of a man standing alone outside after company he hadn't wanted. And then she heard him go into the main house. She finished the stall and moved to the next one and thought about what Pete had said. That evening she went to the fence. Shadow came to the 20-foot mark, and then, while she was talking about the Doyle Creek men and the way Calloway's horse had been held too tight on the bit, he took 3 more steps, 17 feet. She kept talking. Christmas came and went without ceremony, which suited her fine. Wyatt wasn't a ceremonial man, and she hadn't expected one, and the day was cold and the work was the same as any other cold day, and that was sufficient. What she hadn't expected was to come back from the afternoon feeding and find a package on the bunkhouse step. She'd gone back to the bunkhouse after the first night, by mutual unspoken agreement, because the house had been for the emergency and not for the permanent, wrapped in brown paper and tied with string. Inside it, a pair of work gloves. Heavy leather, well-made, fitted for hands smaller than Wyatt's. In the right palm, which she noticed because she checked everything for practical details, there was a small piece of paper. It said, Your grip on the hammer will be better with these. She held the gloves for a moment. She put them on. The fit was close enough that he'd had to pay attention to her hands at some point. Not the measured assessment from the night of the paddock injury, but earlier, the ordinary observation of someone who notices things about a person over time without filing it as noticing. She wore them to the fence that evening. Shadow was at the 15-foot mark when she arrived, which meant he'd been waiting. She didn't anthropomorphize this. She was careful not to attribute things to him she couldn't verify. But the consistency of his positioning had changed over the past weeks in a way that the word waiting was the most accurate description of whatever it did or didn't mean in the interior life of a horse. She told him about the gloves. She told him they were from Wyatt, and she told him she thought Wyatt was the kind of man who didn't do things that cost him nothing, which meant the gloves had cost him something, even if only the admission of having paid attention. Shadow stood at 15 feet, and his ear moved and the cold came down around them both. She thought, we are all 3 of us in the same situation. Damaged in different ways, maintaining a specific distance, trying to figure out how much of that distance is necessary and how much is just fear that has become habit. She didn't say that out loud. It was Pete who told her about the land office, early in January, on a morning when the cold had gotten serious, and they were working extra fast to keep the water lines from freezing. Mercer's been dealing with a boundary dispute, Pete said, pulling insulation around a joint. South parcel, same one Calloway's been eyeing, some filing error from 15 years ago, supposedly. Creates a question about 60 acres of good winter grazing. He paused. Calloway's behind the legal challenge. Not directly. He's got a lawyer doing it, but Pete's behind it. She looked at him. You said Pete, she said. You meant Calloway. Pete looked at her. Did I? You did. A pause. My brother's name was Pete, he said, in a tone she'd never heard from him, and then he went back to the joint, and she understood that she'd just been given something he didn't give people often, and she wasn't going to examine it in front of him. The boundary dispute, she said. It'll cost Wyatt time and money to fight it. Calloway figures if it drags long enough, Wyatt'll settle. Take a buyout on the South Parcel rather than lose another season to lawyers. He finished wrapping the joint. I figure Calloway figures wrong, but it's going to be a hard spring. She thought about this for the rest of the day. She thought about it while she was at the fence that evening, Shadow now reliably at the 15-foot mark, sometimes closer. She thought about what it meant to build something on ground that someone else wanted, and what it took to hold it. She'd been on this ranch for 3 months. She'd put fence posts in ground that had resisted her. She'd learned to sit a horse, read a feed schedule, identify a sick animal, hold a hammer at the right point on the handle. She'd stood in a paddock with a horse that had killed a man and walked back out. She was not leaving. She understood that now with a clarity that had nothing to do with Wyatt's face in the kitchen, or the gloves on her hands, or any of the things that were developing between them, in the careful, unspoken way that things developed when both people involved were constitutionally cautious. It was simpler than any of that. It was the same clarity she'd had standing at the bunkhouse door, looking at Raven Hollow for the first time. This was the ground under her feet, and ground was what she'd been looking for her whole life, and she had found it, and she was not giving it back. Shadow took 2 more steps toward the fence, 13 feet. She stood very still and kept her voice level and talked about the South Parcel and the boundary filing and the fact that Calloway sat his horse too tight and probably did everything else too tight as well, which was a particular kind of man and not a kind that won in the long run. The wind came down off the hills and the cold pressed at everything, and the black horse stood 13 feet away and breathed, and she breathed, and the distance between them was less than it had ever been. She stayed until it was too dark to see him clearly, and then she walked back across the yard to the bunkhouse with her new gloves on her hands, and the cold followed her, and she let it, because she was not afraid of cold anymore. She was not afraid of a lot of things that used to feel large. And the ones she was still afraid of, she was learning to stand inside them without running, which was the only thing fear ever actually required of you, if you were patient enough to find out. The boundary dispute papers arrived on a Tuesday in the second week of January, delivered by a man from town who handed them to Wyatt at the front door and left without making eye contact. Eliza was coming in from the barn when she saw Wyatt standing on the porch with the papers in his hand. He read them standing there in the cold, not moving, and she could tell from the stillness of him, different from his usual stillness, harder and less voluntary, that what was in them was not a surprise but was worse than he'd prepared for. She went past him into the house and put the kettle on. She did not ask. She had learned, over 4 months, that Wyatt processed things in a particular sequence, and questions interrupted the sequence and produced less than waiting did. He came inside about 10 minutes later and put the papers on the table. She brought coffee and sat down. He said, "They're claiming the original survey from 1871 contained an error that misplaced the southeast corner marker by 40 rods. If the court accepts that, the South Parcel boundary moves north, 63 acres, he paused. The winter grazing land, the Good Creek access." She looked at the papers without touching them. "Is the claim credible?" "The survey error is real," he said. "I've known about it for years. It's a legitimate filing error. Some surveyor put a stake in the wrong place in 1871, and everyone built their understanding of the boundary off that stake ever since." He drank the coffee. "What's not legitimate is the timing and who's behind it. Calloway's lawyer found it because Calloway paid someone to go through every land record in the county looking for something to use. So the error is real, but the remedy they're asking for benefits Calloway." "The error is real," Wyatt said. "The remedy they're asking for is a boundary correction that happens to give 63 acres of the most productive land on this ranch to whoever files the adjacent claim, which is currently a shell company that Calloway set up in his wife's cousin's name last September." She looked at him. "You know this. I know this. Does the court know this?" He was quiet for a moment. "Not yet." She sat with that. She pulled the papers toward her and read them, not quickly, reading the way she'd learned to read anything with legal weight, which was slowly and twice, because the first pass showed you the surface and the second pass showed you what was underneath it. It took her 20 minutes. Wyatt sat with his coffee and didn't interrupt. When she was done, she said, "They filed under a statute that requires a response within 60 days. When did this arrive?" "It's dated the 3rd, so 58 days from today." "Who's your lawyer?" "I don't have one currently. The man I used for the deed transfer 3 years ago moved to Denver. You need one in the next 2 days, she said. Not because of the deadline, you have time on the deadline, but because whoever is working for Callaway has been building this for months, and you need someone who can start immediately and work fast. She paused. The shell company is the key. If you can show the court that the entity filing the adjacent claim was established specifically to exploit this survey error after Callaway began investigating it, the judge is going to look at this very differently than a straightforward boundary correction. Wyatt looked at her. She looked back. How do you know that? He said. Sister Margaret at Harlow House used to get the house's legal correspondence, she said. She handled it herself, and she taught me to file and read it because she needed help. And I was there. I'm not a lawyer, but I've read enough legal documents to know what judges look for when they're deciding whether a case is about the law or about something else. He was quiet for a long moment. She taught you to read legal filings. She taught me to file them alphabetically, and I started reading them, Eliza said. There's a difference, but yes. Something in his face did the thing it occasionally did. The architecture of a thought rearranging itself behind the surface. The peach tins, he said, and she didn't know what he meant until she realized he was saying it to himself. Some private notation about the distance between what she appeared to be and what she was. And then she understood he was thinking about the first night, the tins lined up on his shelf, and that this moment was part of a longer pattern he was only now seeing the full shape of. She brought him back. You need a lawyer, today if possible. There's a man in Raven Hollow, he said. Harmon. He mostly does property work. Send Pete into town this afternoon. Wyatt stood up. He looked at the papers on the table. Not with defeat, she noted, not with the expression of a man whose ground was giving way, but with the particular focused anger of someone who had identified the specific shape of a problem and was now calculating how to approach it. I'll go myself, he said. I want to talk to him directly. Good, she said. He went to get his coat. At the door he paused. Eliza. He didn't turn around, but the way he said her name had a weight in it, an acknowledgement of the coffee and the reading and the particular steady way she'd sat at that table for the past 20 minutes while he processed a threat to everything he'd built. Thank you, he said. Go talk to the lawyer, she said. He went. Harmon turned out to be a compact man in his 60s with a gray beard and a habit of tapping his desk when he was thinking that made him seem more agitated than he was. Wyatt came back from town that afternoon and laid out what Harmon had said, and Eliza sat at the kitchen table with a piece of paper and took notes, because Wyatt's memory was excellent, but 2 sets of notes were better than 1. Harmon's view aligned with hers on the shell company question. The key, he'd said, was establishing the timeline. When did Callaway begin investigating the survey records? When was the shell company formed? And what was the documented relationship between Callaway and the individuals named in the filing? If that timeline showed the company was formed after the investigation began, which the September incorporation date already suggested, then the court had grounds to look at the entire filing as a scheme rather than a legitimate boundary claim. He'll need the county records, she said. The survey records going back to 1871 and the land office filings for the shell company. Those are public record. He knows, Wyatt said. He'll also need anyone in town who saw Callaway or his associates at the land office before September. She paused. People remember things when they're asked directly. The land office clerk, whoever is usually there, they'd remember if someone spent time going through old survey records. That's what Harmon said. Then you have a case, she said. It's going to take work and it's going to take money, but you have a case. Wyatt looked at his hands on the table. I have enough for the legal costs. It'll be tight. The ranch is sound, she said. I've been watching the numbers with you for 2 months. The cattle are in good condition, the feed stores will last the winter, and if spring planting goes the way Pete thinks it will, you'll have room. She paused. The 63 acres is important, but losing it temporarily while the case resolves isn't the same as losing it permanently. Don't let Callaway make you feel like the clock is more urgent than it is. He looked at her. Temporarily, he repeated. You'll win, she said. If Harmon does his job and you give him what he needs, you'll win. The law is on your side if the facts are on your side, and the facts are on your side. She said it with a certainty she'd built from the 20 minutes reading those papers and from 4 months of watching Wyatt Mercer operate this ranch, with a precision and care that was documented in every fence line and feed record and water log on the property. She believed it, and she could tell from the way something in him settled slightly that her believing it mattered in a way she hadn't quite calculated. "All right," he said. Well, the legal process unfolded across February with the slowness that legal processes always had, which was its own form of pressure. Not the sharp pressure of crisis, but the grinding pressure of waiting, of having something unresolved sitting at the edge of every day. Harmon filed the initial response within the week. He began pulling records. He found the land office clerk, a woman named Mrs. Adder, who had been at that desk for 11 years and who remembered, very clearly and with some irritation, the man from Doyle Creek, who had spent 3 afternoons in September going through the survey ledgers from the 1870s. That was the first piece. The second piece came from an unlikely direction. Dix, who had been quiet since the barn conversation in October, and who Eliza had categorized as a permanent neutrality, came to her one morning in the barn and said, without preamble, "I know someone who worked at Calloway's place last spring, left on bad terms. Might have something worth hearing." She looked at him. "Tell Wyatt," she said. "I figured I'd tell you first." She understood what that meant. That whatever the shift between them had been, it had accumulated into something that looked like deference on this particular question, and she was not going to let it go to waste. "Tell me and then tell Wyatt," she said. "Tonight." The person Dix knew turned out to be a former Doyle Creek hand who'd been let go in May and had heard, before he left, Calloway talking to his lawyer about a survey problem on the Mercer property. May. 4 months before the shell company was incorporated in September. Harmon called it a material fact. He filed it with the documentation Eliza had suggested, and the picture that emerged for the court was not a good faith boundary correction, but a deliberate scheme built on months of preparation, funded by a man who'd had his eye on Raven Hollow's south parcel for years. The hearing was scheduled for the first week of March. She went to the fence every day through February, in weather that tested the meaning of the word cold, with ice forming on the paddock rails and her breath coming out in clouds, and the new gloves making the difference between functional hands and hands that would have given up on the concept of feeling. Shadow came to 10 feet in the third week of January. He came to 8 feet the first week of February. He did not come closer than 8 feet, and she did not push it. She understood by now that the distance he maintained was not about her, was not a measurement of trust withheld, but was about the specific geometry of his damage, which was not the same as her damage or Wyatt's damage, but was real in the same way, built from the same material of something that had happened and left its shape behind. You couldn't rush that. You couldn't talk it down or logic it away. You could only be present for it consistently, without agenda, until the animal, or the person, decided that the presence was safe enough to allow a little closer. Wyatt started coming to the fence, not every night, not with any announcement. The first time she turned and he was simply there, standing at the outer fence the way she did, 10 feet to her left. She didn't say anything. He didn't say anything. They stood there for 10 minutes in the cold, and Shadow watched them both from his 8-foot mark. And then Wyatt went back to the house, and she stayed another 5 minutes, and then followed. The second time he came earlier and stayed longer. The third time he said while they were both standing at the fence looking at Shadow, "He used to be different, before." He paused. Thomas found him at an auction 2 years before. He was already difficult, not dangerous like he is now, but difficult. Thomas bought him because he thought the difficulty was interesting. A pause. Thomas found everything interesting. That was either his best quality or the one that got him killed, and I've never been able to separate those things out. She didn't say anything immediately. Then, maybe they're not separable. He was quiet. Maybe the same quality that makes someone reach for the difficult thing is the same quality that makes them worth knowing, she said, and you don't get to keep one and give back the other. He stood there with that for a moment. That's not a comforting thought. No, she said, but I think it might be a true one. Shadow was at 8 feet, watching them, and the cold came down off the hills the way it always did, and the three of them stood in it together, which was its own kind of language. The morning she decided to go back into the paddock, she told Wyatt first. This was the difference between December and February. In December she'd acted on instinct and nearly paid for it. Now she sat across from him at the kitchen table. She'd started eating breakfast in the house in January, not by decision, but by accumulation, the way most things between them happened, and she said, "I want to try the paddock again, today." He looked at her. He didn't say no. He didn't say yes immediately either. "What's different from December?" he said. Not a question. An invitation for her reasoning. 8 feet, she said. "He's been at 8 feet for 3 weeks. He's not coming closer on his own from the fence side. I think the fence is a boundary for him, a structural thing, and the only way past it is to change the geometry." She paused. "I'm not going in with anything. No halter, no rope, nothing in my hands. I'm going in to stand at the same distance I've been standing at from the fence side, but from inside. Give him the same experience in a different context. And if he charges, I'll move sideways and not backward, and I won't run. Running is the trigger. I know that now." She paused. "And I want you there. Not inside. At the gate. But there." He looked at her for a long time. She could see the cost of what she was asking, not the physical risk to her, though that was part of it, but the specific cost of standing at that gate watching someone go into the space where Thomas had died and not being able to stop it. "You can say no," she said. "I won't go without your knowing, but I won't stop wanting to go." He stood up. He went to the window. He stood there for a moment looking north, and she waited, and the kitchen was quiet. "After the morning feeding," he said. "When the light is good." She nodded. "After the morning feeding." Pete knew something was happening. He didn't ask, but he worked the morning feeding faster than usual, and when they were done, he stationed himself at the barn door with a deliberateness that told her he planned to be an eyeline of the paddock. She didn't tell him to move. His presence was its own form of acknowledgement, and she'd take it. Wyatt was at the paddock gate when she got there. He unlatched it and held it, and she walked through, and he latched it behind her and stood at it. Shadow was at the far end. She walked to the center of the paddock and stopped. Not the same position as December. That had been closer to the gate, and retreating to the gate had been an option. This was the middle, equidistant, which made the gate less accessible, but also made her less cornered, which she'd thought about. She stood still. She put her hands at her sides. She didn't speak yet. Shadow's head came up. He turned. She watched his ears, the rapid alternation she'd learned to read as calculation rather than pure aggression, the hoarse equivalent of a person working through a problem. He didn't charge. He stood at the far end and looked at her, and she stood in the middle and looked back, and the air between them was very cold and very quiet, and absolutely charged with something that was not quite danger and not quite anything else she had a word for. She started talking. She talked about the South Parcel and the hearing next week, and the shell company with the cousin's name on it. She talked about Harmon and the land office clerk and the former Doyle Creek hand whose departure from Calloway's employ had turned out to matter. She talked about Pete's almost smile and Dick's going quiet, and the gloves on her hands and the cedar smell of the quilt in the room at the end of the hall. She talked about Harlow House and Sister Margaret and Claire's letter, and the train ride west. The woman who'd said the land looks empty, but it isn't. She talked for 20 minutes. Shadow didn't move for the first 10. In the second 10, he took 4 steps forward, 16 feet, closer than she'd ever been to him on the same horizontal plane without a fence between them. She kept talking. At 25 minutes, he took 3 more steps, 13 feet. His ears had settled. Not all the way forward, not flat, somewhere in between. A posture she'd learned to read as alert but listening, which was different from alert but preparing. She stopped talking. She just stood there. Shadow took 1 more step, 12 feet. She felt Wyatt at the gate without looking. She knew the particular quality of his stillness. By now the way you know the quality of a familiar silence. It had a shape to it, a density. He was there, and he was watching, and he was not moving, and that steadiness was part of what was holding the moment together. She raised her right hand slowly, palm out, fingers together, not reaching, just presenting. The way she'd read, in a farming almanac she'd found in the barn, was a way horses sometimes responded to. Shadow looked at the hand. He took 2 more steps, 10 feet. She could see him clearly now, more clearly than she'd ever seen him, without fence rails or distance softening the details. The marks on his flank, the way his chest moved with his breathing, the eye on her side, dark and enormous and absolutely present, tracking her with an intelligence that had nothing simple in it. I was not a simple animal. He had never been a simple animal. She stood at 10 feet with her hand out, and she waited. He took 1 more step. Then he dropped his head. Not all the way. Not the complete lowering that she'd read meant full submission, but part way, a drop of maybe 8 inches, and he blew out through his nose, a long exhalation that was audible across the 9 feet between them. 9 feet. She took one step towards him. She heard Wyatt's breath at the gate. She heard Pete somewhere behind, far back, the sound of a man trying not to make a sound. She stopped at the edge of what felt like the right distance, and she kept her hand out, and she let him decide. Shadow raised his head and looked at her hand, and then, in the specific slow way of something that has decided without announcing the decision, he took the last steps and put his nose against her palm. The contact lasted about 3 seconds. His breath was warm against the leather of the glove. His nose was velvet, which she hadn't expected. She'd been so focused on the danger of him that she hadn't thought about what he'd feel like, and the softness of it was startling in a way that almost undid her composure. He pulled back. He didn't retreat all the way. He stood at 6 feet and looked at her. She lowered her hand. She stood there for another minute, and then she turned and walked to the gate, slowly and without looking back, and Wyatt opened it and she walked through. He latched it behind her, and neither of them said anything for a long moment. She became aware that her hands were shaking, not from fear. The fear had been there, and now it wasn't, and what was left was the physical aftermath of sustained intensity, the body releasing what it had been holding. She pressed her hands together and waited for it to pass. "He touched your hand," Wyatt said. "Yes." He was quiet. She looked at him. His face had the open quality again, the one she'd seen in the kitchen after the paddock in December, and at the fence in the evenings, and once or twice at the table when they were going over the land dispute papers, and he'd looked up at her at a moment he hadn't intended her to catch. It was the face of a man who was not accustomed to being surprised by the world, and who was in the middle of being surprised by it anyway, and who had decided, somewhere along the way, to let that be all right. "Thomas would have—" he started and stopped. "I know," she said. He nodded once. He looked at the paddock, at Shadow standing inside it, at his middle ground distance, and she watched Wyatt look at his horse and understood that something in the looking was different now. Not resolved. She didn't think something like that resolved cleanly or quickly or completely, but shifted. The unresolvable thing, and the grief inside it occupying a slightly different position than they'd held before. She didn't make it into a moment. She went to find Pete, who was at the barn door with an expression he was working very hard to make neutral, and she said, "How's Brick's water intake this week?" Pete looked at her. He looked at her hands, which were still slightly unsteady. He said, "Same as last week. Normal." "Good," she said, and went into the barn. The court hearing was on a Thursday. Wyatt came back in the late afternoon, and she was in the barn, and she heard his horse come into the yard, and she kept doing what she was doing, because however it had gone, it was going to need to be reported in his own time and at his own pace. He came into the barn 10 minutes later. "Harmon filed the timeline evidence this morning," he said. The judge reviewed the incorporation date against the land office visit records. He had questions. He paused. "He continued the hearing 2 weeks. Wants more documentation on the shell company's financing." She looked up. "That's not a loss?" "I know. A continuance means the judge is taking the evidence seriously. If he'd been going to rule in Calloway's favor, he'd have done it today." Harmon said the same thing. "Then trust Harmon," she said, "and let me look at what additional documentation he needs. 2 sets of eyes." Wyatt looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "I trust you more than Harmon." She felt that land somewhere central and private, and she didn't make a show of it. "Harmon knows the law," she said. "I just know what I read." "Between the two of you," he said, "I think we're all right." 2 weeks later, the judge ruled in Wyatt's favor. The shell company's financing had been traceable, with Harmon's additional work, to an account that Calloway held jointly with the cousin whose name was on the filing. The judge's written decision used the phrase "bad faith manipulation of legitimate survey discrepancies" and awarded Wyatt's costs. Calloway's lawyer filed a notice of intent to appeal, and then, 3 weeks after that, withdrew it. The south parcel stayed. The 63 acres of good winter grazing and creek access remained exactly where they had always been on every map and in every practical sense that mattered to the cattle and the water lines and the future of Raven Hollow Ranch. Spring came in April, with mud and noise, and the particular chaos of everything that had been dormant demanding attention at once. She was busier than she'd been at any point in the previous 6 months, which was considerable, and she moved through it with a competence that was no longer something she was assembling from borrowed parts, but something that had become hers, built into the muscle and bone of the daily work. She could ride Cora at a working pace and communicate what she needed through her seat and her weight rather than through the reins. She could read the weather 2 days out from the way the light changed. She could look at a fence line and identify the 3 sections that would fail first and rank them in order of urgency. She could tell when an animal was off without waiting for the obvious signs. She was not the person the Harlow House letter had claimed she was. She was someone better than that, and the difference between the two was the entire winter. What? The people from Harlow House came in May. She was at the fence. Morning now, not evening, because Shadow had started coming to the fence in the mornings too, a reversal of his previous pattern that she was still figuring out. When Pete came to find her and said there was a wagon in the yard with 2 people from town who said they were from an institution called Harlow House. She stood at the fence for one more moment. Shadow was at 6 feet. She said to him quietly, "I'll be back," and turned and walked to the yard. There were 2 of them. A man she didn't recognize, in a good coat, who had the bearing of someone on official business, and a woman she did recognize. Not Sister Margaret, a woman named Sister Frances, who had been at Harlow House for the past 2 years, and who Eliza remembered as the kind of person whose smile never quite reached above the lip line. Wyatt was already in the yard. He'd come out of the main house and was standing with his arms at his sides and his particular watchful stillness. And when she appeared, he moved, almost imperceptibly, to stand slightly closer to her position. She noted this. The man introduced himself as a Mr. Croft, representing the board of Harlow House Charitable Organization. He had papers, which he produced with the air of someone who found paper a deeply satisfying instrument. He explained, in the language of legal correspondence that she recognized immediately, that a review of Eliza's placement had concluded that the terms under which she had been sent to Raven Hollow Ranch were irregular, and that the board was requesting her return to Harlow House pending a formal reassessment of her situation. Eliza listened to all of this. Then she said, "What terms do you mean by irregular?" Croft looked at her. He had the expression of a man who expected the conversation to go differently. The placement was made under a representation of skill and experience that may not have accurately reflected your actual qualifications at the time, he said. The board feels a responsibility to ensure you are situated appropriately. You sent me here falsely representing my qualifications, she said, and now you want to correct that by taking me back. Sister Frances made a sound that was not quite a correction. I've been at this ranch since October, Eliza said. In that time I have repaired fencing, managed livestock, identified and helped resolve a cattle health issue, ridden the East Trail, participated in a legal proceeding that defended this ranch's land rights, and begun a sustained effort with a horse that injured 3 previous hands and killed one. She paused, because she needed to pause, because what she just said about Thomas wanted to pull her sideways, and she didn't let it. My qualifications have been addressed by the work itself. I don't need a reassessment. Croft looked at Wyatt. Mr. Mercer, the organization simply wants to ensure She's employed, Wyatt said. His voice had the quality it had when something was settled and he was doing the courtesy of informing the other party. She's been employed here since October. The terms of her placement, whatever they were, are superseded by the terms of her employment, which are between her and me. The organization has a pastoral interest in... The organization sent a 24-year-old woman to a remote ranch under false pretenses in October with winter coming, Wyatt said, and is now showing up in May when the hard part is done. He looked at Croft without particular hostility, just with the clarity he brought to everything. I understand the pastoral language, but if you had a pastoral interest in Eliza Voss, you'd have had it in October. Sister Frances said, Eliza, we only want to be sure you're comfortable, that this situation is what you want. Eliza looked at her. She thought about the chair at Harlow House that had been cleared out without interval. She thought about Clara's letter and the space that had been filled without ceremony. She thought about Sister Margaret's flat voice and the ledger and the single piece of paper slid across a desk. I'm staying, she said. Sister Frances looked at her with the expression of someone who had prepared for a different conversation. You're certain? Yes. Croft looked at his papers and then looked at Wyatt and appeared to calculate something. Whatever he calculated, it came out in favor of not pushing. He said there would be some formal paperwork to acknowledge the change in her situation, which Harmon could handle, and Wyatt said Harmon would be in touch, and that was that. The wagon left. She and Wyatt stood in the yard while the sound of it faded down the road, and Pete was somewhere behind them, not pretending to work, and Dix was at the barn door with a hammer in his hand and nothing to use it on. Comfortable, Wyatt said after a moment, not mockingly, just turning the word over. I know, she said. Are you? She looked at him. The question was not really about comfort, and they both knew it, and neither of them was going to say what it actually was about yet, because some things built toward their own moment, and rushing them was the surest way to ruin them. Yes, she said. Are you? He looked at her for a moment. Getting there, he said. She nodded. She went back to the fence. Shadow let her touch his nose again that morning, without the glove this time, and the warmth of him was the same startling softness it had been the first time. He allowed it for 5 seconds, then 6, then stepped back and regarded her from his usual distance. She didn't push it. Every day she came back. Every day the distance held or shortened by a fraction. Every day she talked about whatever was immediately true. The spring fencing, the creek level, the letter she'd sent Clara with the description of the East Trail that she thought Clara would find funny, the way Wyatt had looked at the cattle this morning, like he was trying to remember something good. She talked to Shadow about Wyatt, a great deal, which she suspected said something about her that she wasn't going to examine in the direct light. The day she rode him was in June, on a morning when the air was still and the light was the particular gold of early summer that made everything look slightly more substantial than usual. She hadn't planned it as a day for it. She'd come to the fence with a halter, which she'd been bringing for 2 weeks without using, just letting him see it, letting it be part of the ordinary landscape of their time together. He'd sniffed it twice the previous week without pulling back. This morning she opened the gate and walked in and stood at their usual distance and talked for 10 minutes, and then she held the halter out and let him decide. He dropped his head into it. She didn't breathe for about 4 seconds. Then she did. She buckled it slowly, talking the entire time, and he stood for it with his ears in the listening position and his breathing even, and when she attached the lead rope and asked him to walk with her. He moved alongside her without resistance, without drama, like this had always been the arrangement, and they were simply now getting around to it. She led him around the paddock twice. She stopped at the center and stood beside him. He was enormous up close. She'd known this in the abstract, but it was different from this angle, the sheer mass of him, and she understood viscerally why he had been what he had been, the damage he had done, because the power in him was not gone, had never been gone. It was present. It was simply, for this moment, not aimed at anything. She put her hand on his neck. He didn't move. She took a breath, and she put her foot in the stirrup. She'd thought about whether to use one, had decided the first time should have one, that removing all structure at once was its own kind of overreach. And she came up slowly and settled into the saddle. Shadow shifted under her, 1 step sideways, a checking of balance. She sat still and let him check. He stopped moving. She was sitting on Shadow. She took up the reins lightly, the way she'd learned on Cora, with feel rather than control, and she asked him for a walk, and he walked. She didn't realize she was crying until they reached the far end of the paddock, and she turned him back and felt something on her face that she had not authorized. She let it happen. She was far enough from the gate that no one could see clearly, and even if they could, she found she didn't care with the particular freedom of someone who has earned the right not to care what their face does in a moment like this. She walked him to the gate and stopped and got down, and when she turned around, Wyatt was there. He'd come out without her hearing him. He was standing outside the gate with his hand on the rail, and he looked at her and at Shadow behind her, and his face was the most open she had ever seen it. Not the cracked open emergency of December, but something else. Something that had had time to find its shape. It was the face of a man looking at something he had been afraid to want. She led Shadow out of the paddock and through the gate and stood beside him in the yard, and Wyatt put his hand on Shadow's neck beside hers, and the horse stood for both of them. They didn't say anything. There was nothing that needed saying right then that words would have improved. That evening she went to the fence, habit, and also because she understood that the fence visits had never been only about Shadow, had been as much about the quality of attention they required, the discipline of presence without demand, which was a thing she'd needed to practice for her own reasons as much as for the horses. She stood at the fence and looked at the empty paddock where Shadow now had access to the pasture side, through a gate she'd been opening incrementally over the past month. And she thought about what it meant to stay somewhere. Not to arrive. Arriving was the easy part, or the dramatic part, the part people told stories about. Staying was the other thing. The daily unremarkable maintenance of a choice made once and then made again every morning when you got up and went to the barn. She had stayed. She stayed through the cold that found every gap in the bunkhouse walls, through the blisters and the fence posts and the cattle counts and Dix's contempt and the boundary dispute and the Harlow House wagon and all of it. Not because she had nowhere else to go. That had been true in October, and it was not what had kept her here past the point where survival was the only argument. She had stayed because this place was real, and she was real in it, and that combination was rarer than people understood when they hadn't spent 24 years being managed like an obligation. She thought about Thomas, who had not waited. She didn't think about him with the careful distance she'd had to maintain all winter. She let herself think about him directly, a 22-year-old man with a quality that was either his best thing or the thing that killed him, and who was probably both, and who had loved an impossible horse because he couldn't help it, and who had not been wrong about the horse being reachable, only about the timing. She hoped, in the particular way she hoped things she couldn't verify, that somewhere in whatever he had become, he knew how it came out. She heard boots behind her and didn't turn because she knew the sound. Wyatt stood beside her at the fence, not at the 10-foot distance of the early days, but directly beside her, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him in the cold evening air. They stood there for a while. He said, "Pete's going to need help with the north fence before July." "I know," she said. "I looked at it yesterday. The third and fourth sections are the worst. I was thinking we'd start Monday." "All right." A pause. "Eliza," he said. She waited. "I'm not going to make a speech," he said. "I don't do that." "I know," she said. "But I want to say—" He stopped. Started again, in the compressed way he had when the thing he was saying was too large for the efficiency he normally brought to language. "This ranch is better, since October. Not the fencing, not the livestock numbers, not the legal situation, though all of that, but better in the way I mean, which is harder to say." Another pause. "I didn't know I needed someone to stand at a fence and talk to a horse every night. I didn't know that was what was required. But it was. And you did it." He was quiet. "You've done a lot of things I didn't know were required." She looked at him. "I want you to stay," he said. "Not as a hand. Not as someone who's employed here." He met her eyes. "As my partner. In the work, and in the—" He gestured slightly at the house and the land and the whole of it. In all of it. She thought about a lot of things in the space of the next few seconds. She thought about the letter that had sent her here, and about what the word partner contained and didn't contain, and whether she was ready for what it contained. She thought about the cedar quilt, and the gloves, and the peach tins with their labels facing out, and the morning she'd walked out of that paddock with her hands shaking and found that the world had not ended, only changed. She thought about what it meant to be wanted, not as a function or a convenience or a solved problem, but as yourself, as the specific, difficult, particular person you were, with your bad first fence posts and your 12-pound post hole digger and your habit of talking to animals about whatever was immediately true. "Yes?" she said. He nodded. He didn't say anything else because he was Wyatt Mercer, and the word had been enough. They stood at the fence together in the evening light, and somewhere in the pasture Shadow moved through the spring grass with the particular ease of something that had found its way back from a long distance, and the light came down gold and unremarkable over the whole of Raven Hollow Ranch. And it was not a perfect moment. The north fence still needed work, and the legal costs were still being paid down, and she still couldn't back a horse trailer straight to save her life. But it was real. That was the thing about real places and real lives. They didn't resolve into completion. They just kept going, one morning after another, one fence post and one feed bucket, and one cold walk to the paddock after another, and if you were very lucky and very stubborn and willing to stay when everything reasonable told you to leave, they became yours. She had become Raven Hollow's, and it had become hers. And some mornings, when the light was the right kind of gold, and Shadow came to the fence without being asked, and Wyatt was in the yard with his coffee, and Pete was arguing with Dix about something that didn't matter, She stood in the middle of all of it and understood that what the world had thrown away and what the world had built were sometimes the same person. She had been thrown away. She had built herself back here with her own hands, in this hard ground, under this enormous sky. That was not a small thing. That was, in fact, everything.